October 23, 1942. Night fell heavy over the barren expanse of the Egyptian desert. For hours, an unnatural silence blanketed the sands near El Alamein. Then, as if the earth itself had been torn open, the stillness shattered. At exactly 9:40 p.m., more than 1,000 Allied guns roared to life. The ground shook, the desert sky ignited in violent flashes, and a rolling thunder of artillery fire crashed against the German and Italian lines. Soldiers on both sides described it as if the heavens had opened, a storm of steel and fire raining down in unending waves. It was the beginning of the Second Battle of El Alamein, a battle that would decide the fate of North Africa. The desert had become a crucible of global war. What seemed an empty wilderness of sand and rock had immense strategic value. Whoever controlled North Africa controlled the Suez Canal, the vital artery of the British Empire, connecting Europe with the Middle East and the riches of Asia. Beyond lay oil, the fuel of modern war, and the Mediterranean, a sea whose ports and shipping lanes could tip the balance between survival and starvation. By 1942, this seemingly lifeless front had already consumed armies. Italian forces had faltered, drawing Germany into the Desert Campaign. What began as a rescue mission soon became a test of endurance between the Axis and the Allies, fought under scorching heat, blinding sandstorms, and nights so cold they froze men to their rifles. At the center of this struggle stood two names destined for history. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had built his reputation on daring maneuvers and lightning strikes that baffled his opponents. His Afrika Korps, though often undersupplied, fought with skill and tenacity, pushing the British back across Libya and toward Egypt. Opposing him now was General Bernard Montgomery, newly appointed commander of Britain's Eighth Army. Unlike Rommel's flair for improvisation, Montgomery was methodical, determined to rebuild morale, reorganize his forces, and strike only when conditions were right. The stakes could not have been higher. Churchill himself had declared that North Africa must be held at all costs. To lose Egypt would be to lose the war's lifeline. Yet for the Axis, victory here could open the door to the Middle East, threatening Allied oil reserves, and perhaps even linking with German forces driving into the Caucasus. As the first salvos of artillery lit up the desert sky, men crouched in foxholes and trenches felt the world collapse around them. One British gunner later recalled how the horizon seemed to vanish under a curtain of flame, while a German soldier wrote of the earth trembling so violently that it felt as if the desert itself were breaking apart. The atmosphere was thick with dust and acrid smoke, choking the lungs, blinding the eyes, and masking the battlefield in a haze of chaos. This was not just another clash of armies. It was a test of endurance, supply, and willpower in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. In the deserts of North Africa, death came not only from bullets, but from thirst, hunger, and the unrelenting sun. Vehicles broke down in the sand, fuel evaporated in the heat, and even the simplest movement could mean collapse from exhaustion. For Montgomery's men, the opening bombardment was the signal that their long preparation had come to this single moment. For Rommel's soldiers, caught in their bunkers and gun pits, it was a harbinger of the storm about to descend. Both commanders knew that the coming days would decide more than just a patch of desert. The guns thundered on through the night, their echoes rolling across the dunes like distant earthquakes. At dawn, infantry would advance into the minefields, and the long-awaited clash between the desert rats of the Eighth Army and the hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps would begin. El Alamein was no ordinary battlefield. It was the narrow gateway between the Mediterranean and the Qattara Depression, a bottleneck where maneuver was limited, and the full weight of modern warfare would be brought to bear. Here, in this crucible of fire, the fate of North Africa, and perhaps the wider war, would be decided. And as the desert sky pulsed with light, The world waited to see whether Montgomery's gamble would break Rommel's legend. The thunder of El Alamein did not emerge from nowhere. To understand that climactic night, one must trace the path of the man who defined the North African War. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. In February 1941, Rommel arrived in Tripoli with the Africa Corps, a force dispatched to salvage Italy's faltering campaign. The Italian 10th Army had been routed by the British in Operation Compass, losing more than 100,000 prisoners. What began as a rescue mission quickly became Rommel's stage to demonstrate a mastery of desert warfare that astonished both friend and foe. From the moment his boots touched the sand, Rommel moved with unrelenting energy. Within weeks, he launched audacious offensives, driving the British across Cyrenaica in a whirlwind campaign. His method was simple, yet devastating. Strike fast, exploit confusion, and never give the enemy time to recover. Even with fewer tanks, Rommel's use of mobility, surprise, and deception created the illusion of overwhelming strength. At Tobruk in April 1941, he faced one of his greatest challenges. The port, vital to British supply lines, became a fortress under siege. Rommel's assaults failed to take the city, but his relentless pressure tied down Allied forces and added to his growing reputation. Newsreels in Germany celebrated his daring maneuvers, while Allied newspapers grudgingly admired his skill. The Desert Fox, as the British press dubbed him, was born. His victories at Gazala in May 1942 seemed to confirm the legend. Using bold flanking moves, Rommel shattered British defenses, capturing thousands of prisoners and seizing vast stockpiles of fuel and equipment. His army advanced deep into Egypt, and for a moment, Cairo itself seemed within reach. Soldiers under his command recalled his presence at the front lines, standing in the turret of a half-track, binoculars in hand, urging men forward through dust and shellfire. To many, he was not just a commander, but a symbol of invincibility. Yet behind the myth lay fragility. The desert rewarded speed but punished overreach. Every advance stretched his supply lines across hundreds of miles of barren sand. Fuel, ammunition, and even drinking water had to cross the Mediterranean, where Allied submarines and bombers steadily choked Axis convoys. For every tank that rolled forward, another sat immobilized for lack of parts or fuel. One German soldier later wrote of rationing water to a single cup a day, his lips cracking under the sun. While tanks burned out in the dunes with empty fuel tanks, the Italians, on whom Rommel relied heavily, often lacked the equipment and morale of their German allies. Rommel inspired them with his charisma, but they too bore the weight of thin supplies and relentless pressure. The further east the Africa Corps pushed, the more their strength eroded. By late 1942, even as propaganda in Berlin exalted Rommel as a hero, the reality in the desert grew harsher. Allied air superiority increased, strafing convoys and smashing depots. British intelligence, aided by ultra-code breaking, often knew his plans before they unfolded. His army, once agile and dangerous, now fought with dwindling resources, its legendary mobility shackled by the unforgiving terrain and Allied might. Still, the legend endured. To his men, Rommel embodied resilience. To his enemies, he remained a figure to be respected, even feared. Yet the same desert that had once made him famous would soon conspire against him. The vast expanse offered no refuge, no place to hide. As the British Eighth Army prepared for its decisive blow at El Alamein, Rommel, the Desert Fox, would learn that even the most cunning predator cannot outrun the limits of supply, the power of overwhelming force, and the merciless weight of time. The tide was beginning to turn, and the legend that had risen from the sands was about to be tested in fire. After Rommel's string of victories, the British Eighth Army found itself battered and demoralized. The loss of Tobruk in June 1942 had been a humiliation. 33,000 men were taken prisoner, and valuable supplies had fallen into Axis hands. Soldiers of the Eighth Army, known as the Desert Rats for the insignia of the 7th Armored Division, had fought hard, but repeated retreats left morale in tatters. Many wondered if they could ever stop the Desert Fox. That despair began to shift in August 1942, when General Bernard Law Montgomery took command. Montgomery was not flamboyant like Rommel. He was meticulous, disciplined, and uncompromising. Where earlier commanders had tolerated confusion, Montgomery demanded clarity. His message to his men was blunt and unshakable. "We will stand and fight here. There will be no further retreat." He reorganized the army from the ground up. Logistics, often overlooked, became his obsession. Supply lines were tightened, depots carefully stocked, and equipment repaired. Every vehicle, from tanks to transport trucks, was inspected. One British mechanic later recalled working through the night under the desert moon, hands blistered, coaxing broken engines back to life, because Montgomery's staff insisted that no machine could be left idle. Montgomery also transformed morale. He toured the front lines constantly, speaking directly to ordinary soldiers. His presence, tall, lean, and wearing his trademark black beret, gave the men confidence that they had a leader who believed in victory. Unlike Rommel, he rarely exposed himself recklessly to danger, but his steady hand reassured an army weary of improvisation and defeat. Material reinforcements followed. The arrival of American M4 Sherman tanks gave the Eighth Army a decisive boost. Their heavier armor and 75 mm guns outclassed many of the German Panzer III and IV models. Alongside them rolled British Crusaders and Grants, forming armored brigades that Montgomery carefully conserved for the decisive blow. Air superiority, too, tipped in Allied favor. The Royal Air Force, bolstered by American squadrons, harassed Axis convoys and pounded supply depots. But preparation was not merely mechanical. Training became relentless. Soldiers drilled in combined arms tactics, practicing how infantry, armor, and artillery would coordinate in the open desert. Camouflage nets were strung over gun emplacements. Dummy tanks were positioned to confuse Axis reconnaissance, and mine-clearing drills rehearsed the brutal task that awaited them at El Alamein. Life in the desert remained punishing. Sandstorms swept across the camps, blinding men and clogging machinery. Water was rationed, sometimes to less than a gallon a day, leaving soldiers perpetually thirsty. Letters home spoke of searing heat by day, freezing nights, and the constant struggle against flies, dust, and exhaustion. Yet, under Montgomery's system, these hardships no longer felt aimless. Each drill, each repair, each convoy was part of a larger plan that the men could sense taking shape. Commonwealth troops, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, and Free French units played a vital role in this transformation. Their presence gave the Eighth Army both numbers and a sense of international resolve. Many of these men had been fighting in North Africa since 1940, hardened by years of desert war. Under Montgomery's unified command, their experience was sharpened into a disciplined fighting edge. Montgomery was patient. He refused to rush into battle, even as London and Cairo pressed for quick results. He told Churchill himself that the Eighth Army would fight on his timetable, not Rommel's. The men, though restless, came to respect this deliberate approach. One officer later noted that Montgomery gave them something previous commanders had not: the certainty that we would not go forward until we were ready, and that when we did, we would win. By October 1942, the transformation was complete. The Eighth Army was no longer a force in retreat, but a confident, reorganized, and heavily armed juggernaut. Its ranks swelled to over 200,000 men, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, 900 artillery pieces, and the might of the Desert Air Force. The Desert Rats, once beaten and weary, now carried themselves with the conviction that they could match Rommel blow for blow. Montgomery had forged them into a blade. and soon that blade would strike. The stage was set for El Alamein, where preparation, discipline, and resolve would meet the cunning legend of the Desert Fox. By the summer of 1942, Rommel's Africa Corps stood at the very edge of triumph. After sweeping through Cyrenaica and smashing British defenses at Gazala, his forces surged eastward, driving the Allies back in a retreat that seemed unstoppable. On June 21st, Tobruk fell, and with it came a staggering Allied loss of supplies and prisoners. Cairo trembled, and in London, Churchill spoke grimly of the crisis in North Africa. The road to the Nile lay open, but Rommel's army was exhausted. Supply lines stretched more than 1,000 miles across the desert, dependent on convoys crossing the Mediterranean under constant attack by the Royal Navy and the RAF. Fuel was scarce, ammunition rationed, and vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. Still, Rommel pressed on, hoping momentum would carry him to Alexandria. By early July, he reached El Alamein, a narrow bottleneck where the desert met the Mediterranean Sea. To the north lay coastal salt marshes, and to the south, the unforgiving Qattara Depression, impassable for tanks. The geography left only a narrow corridor for battle, a natural choke point that nullified Rommel's talent for sweeping maneuvers. Here, waiting for him, was the British Eighth Army under General Claude Auchinleck. Though battered and demoralized, Auchinleck had reorganized his forces into defensive lines, bristling with barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, and vast minefields. Artillery and infantry dug deep into the sandy ridges, determined to make El Alamein the place where the Axis tide would break. On July 1st, Rommel struck. Waves of German and Italian troops advanced under a scorching sun, only to be met with thunderous artillery fire. Dust clouds rose over the battlefield, blinding tank crews and choking infantrymen. One British soldier later recalled, "You could taste grit in every breath, and when the shells came in, the sand itself seemed to explode." Fighting raged for days. Rommel's armored spearheads probed along the coastal road and inland tracks, but minefields forced them into narrow lanes where British guns waited. At Ruwaisat Ridge, New Zealand and Indian divisions counterattacked fiercely, often at bayonet point. The desert floor became a graveyard of shattered panzers, burning trucks, and wrecked artillery. Auchinleck himself took direct control of the battlefield, moving between headquarters and forward units to steady his men. He ordered aggressive counterstrikes whenever Axis forces seemed poised to break through. On July 10th, Australian troops launched a ferocious night assault at Tel El Asa, overrunning Italian positions and capturing hundreds of prisoners. Their success not only stalled Rommel's advance, but boosted Allied morale at a moment of deep uncertainty. Conditions were brutal. Daytime temperatures soared above 45 degrees Celsius. Water was rationed to a single bottle per man, and soldiers often fought parched and delirious. Flies swarmed over trenches, drawn to the unburied dead. A German officer later wrote in his diary that the desert reeked of fuel, blood, and decay, a place where men and machines died together. By mid-July, Rommel's offensive had stalled. Lacking fuel and replacements, his units could not sustain the pressure. Auchinleck's stubborn defense, combined with relentless RAF bombing of Axis supply lines, forced the Desert Fox to halt his drive toward Alexandria. The Eighth Army, though bloodied, had stood its ground. The First Battle of El Alamein ended in stalemate, but it carried enormous significance. For the first time in months, Rommel had been stopped. The myth of his invincibility cracked, and the Allies gained precious breathing space to rebuild. As the guns fell silent in late July, both sides dug in. Rommel withdrew slightly to regroup, awaiting reinforcements that never truly came. The British, meanwhile, braced themselves for the next round, soon to be led by a new commander, Bernard Montgomery. The Desert War had reached a turning point. The stage was set for a battle that would decide not just the fate of North Africa, but the course of the Second World War. On the evening of October 23, 1942, the stillness of the North African desert was shattered by a thunder that could be heard for miles. At precisely 21:40 hours, more than 1,000 Allied guns opened fire in unison, hurling shells into Axis positions along a 40-mile front near El Alamein. The bombardment was so intense that men later said the desert seemed to shake beneath their boots. For 15 minutes, the sky flickered like lightning as thousands of explosions ripped apart the night. The opening salvo marked the beginning of Operation Lightfoot, Montgomery's carefully planned offensive to break through Rommel's defenses. The name carried symbolism. Infantry would advance first, light-footed enough to pass through the minefields. Only once engineers cleared safe corridors could the heavy armor, the tanks, follow. Those minefields were infamous. Known as the Devil's Gardens, they stretched in dense belts, laced with anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, barbed wire, and concealed gun emplacements. Montgomery knew that tanks rushing blindly into them would be slaughtered. So on that first night, it was the infantry who shouldered the burden. British, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian troops rose from the desert floor and advanced into the darkness, bayonets fixed. Engineers crawled forward with mine detectors and bare hands, probing the sand while tracer rounds whipped overhead. One British sapper later recalled, "Every click of the detector could mean salvation or death." The shells didn't stop, and you never knew if your next step would be your last. Progress was agonizingly slow. The artillery barrage had announced the attack, leaving German and Italian defenders fully alert. From fortified positions, machine guns cut through the desert air, and mortars crashed among the advancing infantry. The minefields themselves claimed victims, men blown apart by sudden eruptions, others trapped by barbed wire as bullets raked the sand around them. By dawn on October 24th, narrow corridors had been carved through sections of the Devil's Gardens, but at a terrible cost. Montgomery had envisioned armored divisions surging through by morning. Instead, progress was measured in yards, not miles. The desert floor was littered with burned-out vehicles and the bodies of men who had fallen in the night. Still, the Allies pressed on. At the northern sector, the Australian 9th Division fought through entrenched Italian defenders, clearing strongpoints bunker by bunker. In the center, New Zealand troops seized parts of Miteraya Ridge, though counterattacks threatened to throw them back. Everywhere, the desert became a cauldron of fire, smoke, and unrelenting pressure. Rommel was absent at the battle's opening, recovering in Europe from illness. Command had temporarily fallen to General Georg Stumme, who died of a heart attack on the very first day of combat, leaving the Axis forces momentarily leaderless. When Rommel returned on October 25th, gaunt and exhausted, he was confronted by a battlefield already buckling under the weight of Allied artillery and infantry assaults. Despite their ferocity, Rommel's German and Italian troops fought with determination. Anti-tank guns knocked out Shermans and Crusaders, attempting to push through the cleared lanes. Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead in desperate counterstrikes, while German infantry clung to defensive positions, forcing the Allies to pay dearly for every inch. Montgomery, however, refused to gamble recklessly. Unlike his predecessors, he did not demand rapid breakthroughs at any cost. His plan was one of attrition, to wear Rommel down, destroy his reserves, and grind his army into exhaustion. Each night, Allied artillery roared again, pulverizing Axis defenses. Each day, fresh units rotated into the fight, pressing the line forward. Personal accounts speak of a battlefield unlike any other. A South African infantryman remembered crossing a minefield at night. You could see nothing but flashes. Men fell all around, but you kept moving, because stopping meant death. Meanwhile, a German soldier wrote of being buried in sand as shells tore our trenches apart, the air so thick with dust that you could not see your own hands. For Rommel, the pressure was relentless. Supplies from across the Mediterranean dwindled as Allied naval and air forces tightened their grip. Fuel shortages crippled the Africa Corps, while Montgomery's Eighth Army drew strength from a steady flow of men, tanks, and ammunition. By the end of the first week, it was clear that the Axis line was beginning to fracture. The minefields had slowed the Allies, but they could not stop them. Montgomery's grinding assault was working. Rommel's defenses were bleeding, his reserves dwindling. The once feared Desert Fox was fighting for survival in a battle he had little chance of winning. Operation Lightfoot had not yet achieved a clean breakthrough, but it had done what Montgomery intended. It locked Rommel's army into a battle of attrition it could not afford. The desert, once a playground for sweeping maneuvers, had become a killing ground where persistence, firepower, and sheer weight of numbers would decide the outcome. The stage was set for Montgomery's next blow, one that would finally shatter the Axis defenses at El Alamein. By the end of October 1942, the battle for El Alamein had dragged into its second week. This desert was scarred by endless craters, twisted wreckage, and the burned-out hulks of tanks that once carried hope for either side. Montgomery's strategy of attrition had begun to pay off. The Eighth Army, reinforced with a steady stream of supplies, tanks, and artillery, pressed relentlessly against Rommel's overstretched defenses. For the Axis, shortages of fuel and ammunition made every hour of resistance harder than the last. On November 2nd, Montgomery launched the decisive phase, Operation Supercharge. Once again, the night sky erupted as hundreds of guns thundered. British and New Zealand divisions spearheaded the assault in the northern sector, supported by waves of Sherman and Grant tanks. The aim was clear: punch through the last coherent Axis line and unleash a breakout into the open desert. The attack fell with overwhelming weight. German anti-tank gunners fought with grim determination, knocking out wave after wave of British armor. But they could not stem the tide. By dawn, the 15th Panzer Division had been reduced to fragments, its men fighting in isolation, cut off by relentless artillery and infantry attacks. Italian units, badly equipped and exhausted, began to collapse under the pressure. One New Zealand officer later recalled, "The enemy was broken. You could feel it in the way their fire slackened, in the way prisoners came in dazed and beaten." Rommel recognized the truth of the situation. His forces were bleeding to death in the sand, with no hope of reinforcement. Yet from Berlin came the chilling order: stand fast, victory or death. Hitler's command left no room for retreat. But Rommel, ever the realist, knew that obedience meant annihilation. He weighed the impossible choice: loyalty to the Führer or survival of his men. For 2 more days, Axis forces clung desperately to their shattered defenses. But Montgomery pressed harder, sending the full strength of the Eighth Army into the breach. The desert became a scene of chaos and collapse. Convoys burned under Allied air attack. Abandoned vehicles smoldered across the sand. Soldiers trudged westward, leaving behind comrades too wounded to move. A German soldier later wrote of a sky filled with enemy aircraft, roads jammed with wrecks, and men stumbling on foot, too weary to speak. On November 4th, Rommel finally issued the order to retreat, defying Hitler's demand to fight to the last. His decision saved thousands from capture or death, but it could not erase the scale of the defeat. The once proud Africa Corps, famed for its lightning maneuvers, was now in headlong withdrawal across hundreds of miles of desert. The retreat would carry them westward through Libya, toward Tunisia, hounded by Allied air power and armored columns every step of the way. For the Allies, El Alamein was more than a battlefield victory. It was a turning point in the war. For the first time, the German army had been decisively beaten on land. The myth of invincibility that Rommel had built in the desert was shattered. His devil's gardens of minefields, his carefully constructed defenses, had been broken apart by persistence, firepower, and overwhelming logistics. The significance was not lost on the world. Winston Churchill, ever a master of words, captured the moment in a speech that echoed across the Allied nations. Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. In Britain, the victory lifted morale from the shadows of defeat at Dunkirk, Greece, and Tobruk. In Germany, it brought a sobering realization that the war in Africa was lost. And for Rommel, it marked the beginning of a long retreat that would end not in Cairo, as he had once dreamed, but in the ruins of Tunisia. The desert had turned against the desert fox. El Alamein was not merely a battle won. It was a symbol that the tide of the Second World War was beginning to turn. The guns of El Alamein fell silent in November 1942, but their echoes carried far beyond the desert sands of Egypt. The battle was more than a tactical victory. It marked the beginning of the end for Axis ambitions in North Africa. From the shattered minefields of the Alamein line, the Allies pursued Rommel's forces westward across the Libyan desert, through Benghazi and Tripoli, until finally cornering them in Tunisia. 6 months after the battle, the Afrika Korps would be no more. For the Allies, El Alamein was a turning point in morale as much as strategy. For the first time since the outbreak of the Second World War, the British Army had dealt Hitler's legions a decisive defeat on land. The world took notice. Newspapers from London to New York carried the story of victory, with Winston Churchill declaring that, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It was not hyperbole. The battle rekindled Allied faith that the tide of war could be turned. The victory belonged not only to Britain, but to the Commonwealth. Australians who had fought stubbornly through Tobruk and Gazala, New Zealanders who had charged into the minefields of Operation Supercharge, Indian infantry enduring the desert's cruel extremes, and South Africans who held the southern sector of the line, all had spilled blood for the victory. El Alamein became a symbol of shared sacrifice, uniting men from distant corners of the empire in a single cause. Yet triumph came at a heavy cost. More than 70,000 casualties were recorded across both sides during the fighting at El Alamein. The cemeteries that today dot the Egyptian coast bear silent testimony. At El Alamein War Cemetery alone, over 7,000 Allied soldiers lie beneath rows of white headstones, many marked only with the words, "Known unto God." German and Italian cemeteries nearby hold the remains of those who fought under Rommel's command. Survivors carried home memories that never faded. One British gunner recalled the desert nights lit by 1,000 flickering suns as artillery thundered without pause. An Australian infantryman wrote of trudging through endless sand, his rifle caked with dust, sustained only by the determination not to yield. German veterans remembered the hopelessness of retreat. Convoys blasted from the sky, comrades lost in burning tanks, the desert stretching endlessly before them. The desert itself was a cruel adversary. Men fought as much against thirst, heat, and sandstorms as they did against each other. Vehicles broke down in the scorching sun, their engines clogged by grit. Wounds festered quickly, medics struggling to keep men alive with limited supplies. In such conditions, bonds of camaraderie were forged that would outlast the war itself. Looking back, El Alamein reshaped the course of the Second World War. It denied the Axis the chance to seize the Suez Canal, cut Britain off from Middle Eastern oil, or strike deep into Egypt. More importantly, it proved that German forces, once thought invincible, could be broken. From North Africa, the path opened to the Allied invasion of Sicily and the slow, grinding advance into Italy. Today, the legacy of El Alamein endures not only in history books, but in the solemn rows of graves that overlook the battlefield. Memorials in Egypt stand as reminders of the scale of sacrifice, visited by veterans, families, and travelers who pause to reflect on what was endured in the desert. The names carved into stone speak to a generation that fought far from home, in a place where victory was won at a terrible price. The film closes as it began, with the night of October 23, 1942, when the desert erupted in fire and thunder. But now the moment is reframed, no longer as the start of a desperate gamble, but as the beginning of Axis decline. In the sands of El Alamein, the desert rats and their allies turned the tide of war. The battle's legacy is not merely one of victory, but of resilience, sacrifice, and the knowledge that history itself shifted on those barren dunes.